The clock on the wall marked 3 a.m., though the hands seemed frozen, as if even time itself refused to move through that hour. Outside, the wind pressed against the house like something alive, whispering through cracks and stirring the thin curtains that swayed above the cold wooden floor. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the world damp and heavy, but now there was only silence. A kind of silence that did not feel natural. It was the kind that pressed against the chest, making every breath sound too loud, too exposed. In the distance, a branch snapped, and then, as though carried by some unseen hand, came the sound. 3 knocks. Slow. Hollow. Certain. Each strike against the door echoed through the small house, bouncing from wall to wall until it settled deep within the bones of the woman who had just opened her eyes. She lay there in bed still, her pulse loud in her ears. The knock came again, a soft rhythm this time, as though whoever or whatever stood on the porch had grown impatient. She whispered her husband's name, but the only reply was the sound of the ceiling fan turning, a slow rotation that stirred the shadows across the walls. She called out again, louder now, but no one answered. The house remained heavy and unmoving. A dog began barking somewhere far down the road, its cry long and frantic, rising into the black air before it was abruptly cut short. She pushed back the covers, her feet meeting the cold floor, and for a moment she stood there, listening. The knock did not come again, but the air felt charged, a quiet waiting. She walked through the narrow hallway, each step creaking beneath her weight, the house breathing around her. A picture frame hung crooked on the wall as though it had been touched. The sound of dripping water came from the kitchen sink, though she remembered turning the tap tightly shut before bed. When she reached the front door, she did not open it right away. Instead, she leaned close, pressing her ear against the wood. Nothing, no movement, no breath, just the sound of her own heartbeat echoing faintly through the stillness. The porch light, dim and yellowed, cast a faint glow beneath the door. She could see the shadow of the frame, but no feet beneath it. Whoever had been there was gone. She almost turned back then, almost told herself it had been her imagination when the knocking returned. Louder this time, forceful, shaking the door on its hinges. She stumbled back, a gasp caught in her throat. Her hand reached for the lock, though it was already bolted. The chain trembled slightly, like something was pulling at it from the other side. Her husband appeared at the end of the hallway then, half asleep, his voice hoarse as he asked what was happening. But when he reached her and placed his ear against the door, the knocking had stopped again. Only silence remained. They both waited there for a long moment, each listening for any trace of sound. Then faintly came a new noise, from the window in the living room, a slow drag like fingertips brushing against the glass. He moved toward the sound, cautious but drawn by something he could not name. The woman stayed behind, her breath shallow, her hands gripping the fabric of her nightgown. She could hear the soft squeal of his bare feet on the wooden floor as he crossed the room. When he reached the window, he lifted the curtain just an inch, and what he saw made him freeze. A face, pale and featureless, pressed against the glass from the outside. It was neither a man nor a woman, but something else entirely. Something that seemed to mimic human shape without understanding it. The eyes, if they were eyes, reflected nothing. Just a flat blackness that swallowed the faint light from the lamp behind him. He stumbled backward, his voice caught somewhere between disbelief and terror. When he looked again, the figure was gone. The yard outside was empty, no footprints in the mud, no sign of movement. The rain had washed everything clean. They stood together now, both trembling, trying to make sense of what had happened. But deep down, neither could shake the feeling that something had entered with the knocking. Not a person, but a presence. In the hours that followed, they sat awake in the living room, lights on, waiting for the dawn. Every sound and the creak of the house, the settling of the walls, made them flinch. When the first light of morning crept through the curtains, it did not bring comfort. The shadows did not retreat as they should have. The corners of the room seemed darker, heavier, as if carrying something unseen. The woman tried to open the front door, but the lock resisted her hand. It was not jammed. It was as though it did not want to open. That morning, as the town began to wake, she stood at the window, looking out at the quiet road that led into the forest. There were no signs of visitors, no tracks in the dirt, no broken branches, nothing. And yet she could not shake the sound that had woken her, the rhythm of those 3 deliberate knocks. It had not been random. It had not been human impatience. It had been something else, something that waited for acknowledgement. They never spoke of it again, at least not to each other. But every night after that she found herself listening, counting the seconds between the turning of the clock and the silence that followed. Somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the dim light of the porch, something waited. It had knocked once. It could knock again. And the question lingered like the echo of those three hollow sounds. What happens when something you cannot see knows your name and finds your door in the dead hour of the night? The house had stood on the edge of the forest for nearly 60 years, long before the couple ever moved there. It had belonged to a family once, a quiet family that vanished from the town's memory almost entirely. Old neighbors, when asked, said the land had always carried a strange silence, the kind that did not feel like peace but rather a pause, like something was listening. The property sat just beyond the last streetlight, where the gravel road faded into dirt, and the woods began their slow, endless stretch into darkness. At night, even the animals kept their distance. No birds sang in the trees, no insects hummed near the porch light. The air seemed too thick for sound, too heavy for life. When the couple first saw the house, they thought the isolation would bring comfort. They had grown tired of city noise and sleepless nights filled with sirens and restless neighbors. Here, the realtor said, they could breathe again. Here time moved slower. The structure was worn but solid. A narrow two-story home with pale siding, a wraparound porch, and a roof that sagged slightly under years of quiet neglect. They bought it without hesitation, telling themselves that silence was the same as safety. The husband found work in town, repairing engines at a local workshop. The wife spent her days restoring the home, painting walls and growing herbs along the windowsill. For a time it felt like life had found a rhythm, yet even then, before the first knock, there were moments that unsettled them, brief flashes that broke the stillness. Sometimes the lights flickered when she passed certain parts of the hallway. Sometimes she would find the back door slightly open in the morning, though she remembered locking it. Once she heard footsteps in the attic above while she was folding laundry, slow and deliberate, one after another. When she told her husband, he searched the space, finding nothing but dust and a single old rocking chair. He laughed it off as the sound of wood settling, but she noticed that the chair kept swaying long after he had stopped it. The townspeople were kind but guarded. Whenever she mentioned where they lived, she noticed how faces changed, polite smiles fading just enough to reveal something beneath them, pity, or perhaps warning. One woman, a cashier at the grocery store, once whispered that no one had lived in that house for more than a few years at a time. "Too quiet out there," she said, glancing toward the door. "People hear things, lose sleep, then they leave." The wife tried to laugh it off, but later as she drove home under the dim glow of her headlights, the words stayed with her. Too quiet. Winter came early that year. The trees shed their leaves before the first snow fell, leaving the forest bare and skeletal. The house felt different then, colder, emptier, as though it had begun to remember something the new owners could not. On some nights she swore she could hear faint voices from the woods. Not words exactly, just the sound of breath moving through branches, whispering her name in a rhythm she could not quite understand. Her husband told her it was the wind, always the wind, but he had started leaving the porch light on too. There was one story she remembered hearing from an old man at the hardware store. He said that long ago, back in the 1960s, a family who lived in that same house had reported strange knocks at the door, always around the same time, 3 in the morning. They never found out who or what caused it. The police checked the area, found no footprints, no tire tracks. The family stayed a few more weeks before packing up and leaving without saying goodbye. The old man had smiled when he told it, but it was not a pleasant smile. It was the kind people use when they are unsure if they should speak at all. The wife thought of that story often after the knocking began. She had dismissed it at first, but as nights grew longer, she started noticing smaller things, the way mirrors seemed colder to the touch, the way the air near the front door felt heavier, as though someone stood just on the other side. She tried praying, whispering words she barely remembered from childhood, but the silence afterward felt like mockery. Her husband grew distant as well. He spent more time at work, returning home late, tired and quiet. When she asked if he had noticed anything unusual, he avoided her gaze. Once, after she pressed him, he admitted that he too had heard something, breathing maybe, or movement outside his workshop when no one should have been there. He said he tried to follow it, but it always stopped just out of sight, just beyond the corner, waiting. The nights became heavier. The air itself began to change. There were moments lying in bed when she would awaken suddenly, not to sound, but to an absence of it. A silence so complete it felt alive. She could feel something watching, not with eyes, but with attention. It studied her, measured her, waited. She began leaving small offerings on the porch without knowing why. A candle, a cup of water.
Once a loaf of bread.
She told herself it was a harmless superstition, a way to calm her nerves. But deep down she knew it was more than that. It was instinct, some ancient unspoken part of her trying to appease something unseen. When she told her husband, he only stared at her for a long moment and said quietly, "Whatever it is, do not open that door again." The next night, at exactly 3 in the morning, the knocking returned. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. The same rhythm as before, but this time it came not from the door. It came from the walls inside the house. After the knocking began to move within the walls, the house no longer felt like theirs. It seemed to breathe with them, to listen when they spoke, to hum softly in the hours before dawn. What had once been the comfort of quiet now became unbearable. Every small creak felt deliberate. Every gust of wind seemed to carry intention. The wife stopped sleeping first. She would lie awake, counting the seconds between each passing sound, listening for the rhythm that had claimed their nights. Her husband tried to pretend nothing had changed, but the dark rings beneath his eyes betrayed him. He had begun to wake up standing, disoriented, as though something had called him from sleep and guided him through the hallways without memory. One morning, she found muddy footprints near the back door. They were shaped like human prints, but wider, as though something heavy had pressed deep into the wood. The strange thing was the direction. They began inside the house and led outward. She followed them until they disappeared near the tree line, ending where the forest began. She showed them to her husband, but he only shook his head, saying they must have been his from the night before. Yet she could see his shoes by the door, still clean. Days became a blur of fear and denial. She started noticing changes in small objects. Her keys left in places she did not remember, her cup half filled in the morning though she had emptied it. Once, she found the rocking chair in the attic turned toward the window facing the woods as though someone had been sitting there watching something outside. It moved gently when she entered the room, the sound of its wooden legs dragging against the floor like a slow breath. She refused to go back up there after that. At night, the knocking grew stranger. Sometimes it came from the ceiling, other times from beneath the floorboards. It always came in threes, never more, never less. A slow, hollow beat that pulsed through the air like a heartbeat. The walls seemed to absorb it, carrying the sound through every room until it surrounded them. They called the local police once, though neither truly believed it would help. 2 officers came, polite but distant. They searched the yard, checked the locks, even walked into the forest with flashlights. They found nothing, no prints, no sign of intrusion. One of them mentioned that there had been similar calls years ago, around the same stretch of land. He said it casually, but she caught the way his tone faltered near the end, as if he realized too late that he should not have said it. That night, the couple slept with the lights on. But light did not stop it. The knocking came again at 3 a.m., echoing through the brightness like it had never cared for darkness to begin with. The husband tried to confront it, slamming his fist against the wall and shouting for it to stop. For a few moments it did. The silence that followed was worse. It was complete, absolute. Then, just as he turned to her, something knocked from behind him, from inside the wall he had just struck. He fell silent, staring at the plaster as dust drifted down from the impact. She wanted to run, to leave that very moment, but her legs refused to move. She felt as though the house were holding her there, its weight pressing down through every beam and nail. When morning came, they did not speak of it. There was nothing to say that would make sense. By the 3rd week, their movements became mechanical. They moved through rooms cautiously, avoiding certain corners. The wife stopped looking out windows after sunset. The husband began locking himself in the garage at night. She heard him talking sometimes, whispering to himself, or to something she could not see. When she asked, he claimed he was praying, but the tone of his voice was not prayerful. It was bargaining. One afternoon, she found him staring at the front door, his hand resting gently on the handle. He looked as though he was listening. She asked what he heard, and he only said, "It is waiting." She tried to pull him away, but his hand refused to move. His eyes seemed unfocused, his breathing shallow. It was only when she shouted his name that he blinked and stepped back as though waking from a trance. She began keeping notes after that. Short descriptions of every sound, every time the knocking occurred. She recorded the dates, the direction, even the temperature of the rooms. It was always coldest near the front door, regardless of the season. Sometimes she found the doorknob damp, as though touched by rain. Yet no rain fell those nights. The metal smelled faintly of soil, of something buried. On one of those nights, she tried to record the sound on an old tape recorder. She placed it on the table near the door and waited. The knocks came at exactly 3:04 a.m., louder than ever before. 3 distinct strikes. When she played back the tape in the morning, the knocks were gone. In their place was a faint whisper, so soft it was almost mistaken for static. She turned the volume higher, pressing her ear against the speaker. The whisper was not random. It was her own name, repeated over and over, spoken by a voice that sounded distant yet close, as though it came from inside the recorder itself. That morning, her husband found her sitting on the floor, still listening to the looped playback. He took the tape, walked outside, and burned it without a word. For the rest of that day, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavier than before, filled with things they no longer dared to say. By the end of that week, she started seeing movement in her reflection. The glass on the hallway mirror shimmered slightly as if water moved behind it. Once, she saw something pass just over her shoulder, a blur of gray that disappeared when she turned. She covered the mirror with a cloth after that. But sometimes, when she passed by, she could still hear faint tapping from behind it, always in threes. Every night, at 3 a.m, the knocking returned. Sometimes softer, sometimes violent, but always precise. It no longer sounded like someone asking to come in. It sounded like something that already had. The first sign that their story had escaped the boundaries of their home came in the form of a quiet knock at the door, not at 3 a.m. this time, but in the dull light of afternoon. A man stood there in a heavy coat, a notepad in hand, his face weary and lined by years of listening to other people's fears. He introduced himself as a private researcher, someone who collected unexplained phenomena for an independent journal. He had heard whispers about their case from the police report, the same one that had been filed weeks earlier when they had called for help. At first, the couple wanted nothing to do with him. They were tired, hollowed out, and wary of strangers. But there was something in his tone that made them hesitate, something patient, curious, and deeply human. He asked simple questions at first. When had the knocks begun? Had they ever seen anyone outside? Did they keep a record of what they heard? The wife hesitated, then retrieved the notebook she had been keeping, its pages filled with scrawled observations and sleepless handwriting. He flipped through it carefully, pausing when he saw the same number written again and again. 3. 3 knocks. 3 a.m. 3 minutes between the last sound and the silence that followed. He asked if there was any reason that number mattered to them, any significance in their lives. They both shook their heads. It meant nothing, and yet it ruled their nights. The researcher inspected the house, moving from room to room with a small handheld device that emitted a soft, steady hum. He explained it measured electromagnetic fields, changes in energy that could, in theory, explain the sensations they described. The readings were normal until he reached the hallway that led to the front door. There the device flickered violently, its needle swinging into the red before falling still again. He frowned, tapping the casing, but it refused to respond anywhere else in the house. Only there. Only near the door. When asked about the history of the property, the wife told him what little she knew. The story of the vanished family, the warnings from townspeople, the rumors of noises that had driven others away. He nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had already suspected. He mentioned a theory about place memory, the idea that traumatic events could imprint themselves on physical spaces, replaying echoes of the past like grooves in a record. If something violent or sorrowful had happened here, he said, the house might be responding to it. But when the husband asked what that something could be, the researcher did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked if they had ever seen anything inside the house that did not belong to them. The question hung in the air like a breath. The wife looked toward the covered mirror in the hallway. She had not told him about what she saw or thought she saw reflected there. He noticed her glance but said nothing. Before leaving, he set a small recording device near the front door and told them to leave it running overnight. He promised to return the next day. That night, neither of them slept. The recorder blinked faintly in the darkness. its red light pulsing with every quiet sound the house made. The knocking came as expected, 3 precise strikes at exactly 3 in the morning. The air grew colder, the walls seemed to tighten, and for a moment it felt as if the house itself inhaled. The wife reached for her husband's hand, but his fingers were trembling. They sat in silence until dawn. When the researcher returned, he found them waiting on the porch, eyes red and hollow. He retrieved the recorder and played it in the living room. The first few hours were uneventful, distant creaks, the low hum of electricity. Then came the knocking, clear, sharp. It echoed through the device exactly as they remembered it. But after the third knock, something else followed. A faint sound beneath the static. At first it seemed like breathing, rhythmic and steady. Then came a whisper, one that neither of them could identify. The voice was distorted, layered over itself like overlapping memories. When the researcher slowed the playback, the whisper formed words. "You heard me." The wife turned pale. Her husband stood abruptly, pacing the room. The researcher remained still, his expression unreadable. He replayed the phrase several times, lowering the volume until the words seemed to fade back into the static. He said it could be interference, a mix of ambient sounds blending in unpredictable ways, but his tone betrayed uncertainty. He left soon after, promising to analyze the recording in his lab. 2 days passed. They heard nothing from him. On the third day, the wife decided to drive into town to find him. She reached his office, a small space above a bookstore, but the door was locked and the blinds drawn. When she asked the shopkeeper below, the man said the researcher had packed up and left the previous evening. No explanation. No forwarding address. Just gone. That night, the wife found a plain envelope taped to their front door. Inside was the recording device. No note, no message, just the recorder and a new tape inside. When she played it, there were no knocks, no whispers. Only the sound of the researcher's voice, tired and strained. "Do not stay," he said. "Do not wait for it. It does not come to your door. It comes through it." She stopped the tape immediately. Her husband took it from her and threw it into the fireplace, watching as the flames licked over the plastic until it melted into a dark puddle. The air in the house grew heavier that night, as though whatever lingered there had been listening. From that point on, the knocks no longer followed a pattern. Sometimes they came twice in one night, sometimes not at all, but the silence between them carried its own weight, thicker, more deliberate, like the pause before a whisper. The wife began hearing faint words again, not from the recorder this time, but from inside the walls themselves. She could not make out what they said, only the tone, pleading, hungry, patient. The husband started sleeping in the garage, though she could hear him talking softly out there, repeating something over and over. She never caught the words, but she knew their rhythm matched the knocking. He had begun to answer it. By the end of that week, the house no longer felt like a structure of wood and nails. It felt like a body, breathing, pulsing, alive with something neither human nor entirely foreign. The door, once a barrier, now seemed part of it, and every time the clock neared 3, the air thickened with the same unspoken question. Whatever had been knocking was no longer asking to be let in. It was asking what they were still doing there. The human mind was not built to live beneath the weight of constant waiting. By the time winter surrendered to the first hesitant warmth of spring, the couple had begun to move like people who no longer believed the world outside truly existed. The house had consumed their hours, their sleep, their sense of time. They existed in a rhythm measured only by the sound of the clock and the unseen hands that sometimes tapped at the walls. The wife stopped opening curtains. Daylight felt foreign now, too loud and too bright against what had become their world of half-lit rooms. The husband's skin had grown pale from nights awake and days spent motionless in the garage. Sometimes she would find him staring at the door again, whispering softly. His eyes glazed as though listening to a voice she could not hear. When she asked him what it said, he only answered, "It remembers." Her dreams became places rather than stories. She dreamed of corridors that stretched endlessly, walls that pulsed like veins. Always there was a sound ahead of her, rhythmic and distant, 3 knocks echoing somewhere down the hall. When she woke, her heart already raced as though the dream had been waiting for her return. She started keeping the bedroom light on at all times, afraid of what the dark might reveal. Yet the light did not make her feel safer. It only revealed how hollow their lives had become. There were moments when she thought she could hear something breathing behind the thin walls, steady and patient, as if the house were alive and listening. She tried to escape the feeling by spending afternoons outside, but the air there felt no cleaner. The trees seemed to lean toward the house, their branches pointing like accusing fingers. Even the birds avoided the roof. The world had rearranged itself around that small wooden structure, like gravity bending toward an unseen center. When she sat on the porch, she sometimes caught movement at the edge of her vision, shadows gliding between trees, too tall and thin to be people. They never came closer than the tree line, but she felt watched all the same. Her husband stopped speaking altogether for several days. He wrote notes instead, simple phrases on scraps of paper. "Do not answer it. Keep the door locked. It knows your name." She found them scattered across the kitchen counter, tucked into her coat pocket, even slipped between pages of the Bible that she had left unopened on the nightstand. His handwriting was uneven, trembling. When she finally confronted him, his face seemed older, sunken, and she saw that his fingernails were cracked and blackened at the edges, as though he had been clawing at something. He denied it, said it was oil from the garage, but she found no tools there anymore, only deep gouges in the wooden workbench that matched the marks on his hands. The air inside the house grew colder despite the turning of the season. The furnace worked, but warmth refused to settle. The wife began hearing the faint echo of knocking even during the day, soft and persistent like the sound had seeped into the walls themselves. Sometimes she felt it beneath her feet, faint vibrations rising from the foundation. She tried to tell herself it was the shifting of the ground, the natural settling of the house, but deep down she knew the rhythm was too deliberate. Always three, always in the same steady pattern. Sleep became a memory neither of them could reach. Their eyes were glassy, unfocused, red-rimmed from exhaustion. They moved past each other like ghosts, neither daring to mention the sound anymore. Denial was the only language they had left. Yet the body could not lie. It trembled even when the mouth refused to speak. The wife found herself listening to the silence more than the noise, because silence now meant anticipation, the held breath before something reached across from the other side. One evening, she returned from town with groceries and found the front door open, just slightly, enough to reveal a sliver of the hallway beyond. The air that met her face was damp and cold. She stepped inside cautiously, calling her husband's name. No answer. The house was still unnervingly so. The clock in the living room had stopped at 3. She followed the sound of faint movement upstairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. When she reached the bedroom, she froze. The bed was empty, but the window stood open, curtains blowing inward. On the glass, faintly visible in the condensation, were 3 perfect handprints, not pressed from outside but from within.